Good evening. I'll call this May 12th, 2021 meeting of the Town Plan and Zoning Commission of the Town of Fairfield to order. Tonight is a planning meeting. We're acting in our capacity as planners. And the first agenda item is a planning discussion. So, Jim, if you would, Mr. Wynn.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, this is refreshing lately because this is, first of all, there is no pending special permit application. So I just want to remind everybody of that. We're dealing only with the regulation amendment. And it's a matter for which you have complete discretion, which is refreshing. This is not something which we've got hands tied behind our back. This is something where you have complete discretion over this process. So I'm just going to do a little step back a little bit and try to put into context where some of these recommendations for TOD downtown recommendations came from. Then we'll talk about the regulations specifically. And then we have a PowerPoint presentation to share with you. We've done, we've gone through some photos of buildings that you will recognize in our downtown and talk about what their heights and FARs are, just to give you a visual sense of comparison for what we're talking about in these regulation proposals. So that's very good. That's our plan going forward. So as you know, hopefully the Transit-Oriented Development Study, or TOD study, was adopted in October of 2019. And it is true that that study was focused primarily around the Metro Center station. However, the study also did look at how TOD development could proceed on a limited basis in our Fairfield downtown station area. I'll quote from page 2 of that study, quote, "The downtown station area is part of a mature and well-loved downtown. So this effort looked at whether there were opportunities for small-scale contextual infill development that would help serve town goals for a walkable downtown area." That's the quote. And there was a whole bunch of market research that was done as part of that study. And that market report identified that from a office market standpoint, the downtown was best positioned for maybe 10 to 20,000 square feet of professional or medical office at a small scale tenant size. Not a huge, strong market for office space presently, but there's quite a strong office demand for multifamily at both the downtown and Metro Station, and particularly downtown. Over the next 5 to 10 year market capture rate, they estimated of between 115 and 150 units per year. So pretty strong market, as we've seen people, obviously interested in doing some residential downtown. Mm-hmm. Among the goals that were identified in the TOD study were to firstly encourage housing development that expands unit type and cost options, particularly for young professionals and seniors who have fewer options matching their preferences, and expands the town's supply of affordable housing. The next goal identified was to help the downtown thrive as a walkable community destination. And the third was to keep Fairfield's finances and sense of community strong. And part of that discussion, and keep in mind when we talked about in our POCD work, that our commercial footprint is only 5% of our total land area. So we get 10% of our income stream from 5% of our land area. On page 12 of the study, there's a quote about downtown. It says, "In downtown, Fairfield community members wanted to ensure that any changes helped improve the station area's already prized walkable character and preserve the modest scale of downtown buildings." And if you recall, in our winter workshop meetings of 2020, there was some public outreach feedback that supports the idea that more opportunity for multifamily housing in our commercial districts would be appropriate. So with that kind of quick backdrop, I'm just going to remind you, what then are these specific proposals we're talking about? You've heard this before, but it's been a while since we've talked about this specific proposal. So I'm going to walk through these and then we'll get to our PowerPoint discussion. Mm-hmm. So the first proposal is section 12.3.16, Our current regulations restrict residential use to not more than 2 stories and no more than 50% of the area of the building that it occupies. The application seeks to eliminate those 2 limitations and also to reduce the minimum floor area from what's presently 750 square feet per unit to 450 square feet. And during the hearing, you'll recall, excuse me, that the applicant pointed to specific sections of the TOD to kind of back up why they were making those proposals. And with respect to the floor area provision, the TOD study says that these 2 restrictions on upper floor residential area inhibit the development of mixed-use buildings with retail, dining, and other permitted uses on the ground floor and 3 floors of residential uses above. Removing this restriction would enable more infill development in the downtown station area and additional housing options serving town needs. Regarding the minimum unit size, the TOD study referenced the then existing current accessory apartment requirement size of 450 square feet and thought it would be appropriate and for market supported size for households seeking a compact, more affordable unit. And so the recommendation was to match up those 2 requirements. And I should note, though, that subsequent to that plan adoption, we did this, when I say we, I mean you, amended the accessory apartment regulations earlier this year that eliminated that minimum lot area. So the proposal is to match the previously existing accessory apartment size of 450 feet.
And just if I could interject there, when we amended the accessory apartment regs with respect to minimum dwelling size, unit size, I think we were informed by the fact that the health code and the building code have requirements that have to be met.
That's correct.
Is there a particular square footage requirement?
There is. I had it when we were talking about. I apologize for not having it with me. There's a minimum living space size per room and sleeping area size. And as a matter of fact, with all of the discussion with the land use bills that are pending in Hartford, a couple of them in their revision of 8-2, the enabling statute, at least one of the bills proposes to spell out in the statutes that you cannot require a minimum unit size. So I think there's case law that says that it's discriminatory to set a minimum because, as you said, Lenny, the health and building codes already require a certain minimum. So again,
essentially our zoning code doesn't regulate the minimum dwelling size anymore. We did in the accessory dwelling regs previously, but now we don't.
Well, we don't in the ADU. We do in other provisions. We do here presently require 750 square feet, and the proposal seeks to reduce that to 450.
Got it.
And we'll circle back to that. So then the next provision is section 12.7.4. where our present regulations allow a maximum height of 5 stories and 50 feet in our center design district, and the applicant is proposing to reduce that to a 4-story of livable floor area, but increase the height from 50 feet to 55 feet, while also requiring a minimum ground floor height of 15 feet. And that coincides to some degree with the TOD study recommendation that again, I quote, in practice with modern construction techniques and desirability of taller ground floor heights to accommodate retail and dining space, this means that buildings will not achieve 5 stories. Modifying the height limits to be capped at 4 stories while allowing 52 feet in overall height would allow for the tall floor-to-floor heights required by high-value spaces while maintaining the overall appearance and massing and height to limit that to closely, to keep buildings in their existing context. So again, the first is a provision for how much residential you can have in a building. The second provision is the height, reducing the story height by 1 story, but increasing the overall footage by a few feet.
And the applicant proposed to increase that to 55 instead of 52.
Correct. Our study recommended 4 stories 52. The applicant is proposing 4 stories 55.
Did our study recommend a bottom floor height of 15, or is that just
It
standard?
does. It does. The provision, they are dovetailing that with the recommendation because the desire there at a higher floor height, it gives more flexibility to what types of uses can come and go in those spaces. And as we've seen in newer construction, for example, the buildings, the two trademark proposals down by Fairfield Metro have 15-foot or higher ground floor space for more dramatic retail or restaurant space. And then 11, typically around 11-foot floor plates for the residential. So older construction was a little bit more compressed in their height. Newer stuff, especially if they want to be higher end, we see in new construction residentially a lot of 10 to 11-foot high ceilings within the space. And then there's usually a foot or two between that ceiling and the next floor. So the next provision is 12.7.5.2. This is regarding the total amount of square footage or total massing of a building you can have on the lot. The present limit is 200% of the area of the lot, or a floor area ratio of 2 times the lot size. The applicant is proposing to raise that total floor area to 300% or an FAR of 3.
So,
again, this coincides. What's up?
So in other words, if you wanted to have a 3-story building, essentially you could still be at 100% or 90% coverage with some modification.
Correct. So when I get to the end, I'll kind of talk about how all of this kind of plays off each other.
Got
it. The TOD study again recommended that our current regs have a maximum lot coverage of 90%, but a 5-story minimum height with the current maximum lot FAR of 2, you're not going to achieve a taller building. So they're recommending that we consider increasing that FAR to 3 to enable development of buildings in the 3 to 4-story range is what was required there. Again, that scale is consistent with existing buildings and walkable. But as we continue talking about this, all of these things, development has to satisfy all of the requirements. It's not a menu of, well, I'll comply with this, but not that. So the total floor area ratio, the setbacks, the parking, all have to be compliant. And the vast majority of the time, the most limiting factor that constricts the total square footage of a potential development is their ability to provide the requisite parking. We've had for more than 30 years a 5-story 50-foot height requirement, but there's only a scant number of buildings that achieve that height because you need a large enough parcel to not only accommodate the height but to accommodate the parking and the FAR and the setbacks. So obviously by saying or allowing 50 feet and 5 stories doesn't mean that everybody's going to build the 50 feet and 5 stories, because we've had that regulation for generations and we don't have that many buildings of that height, mainly because all of the other design requirements still also have to be met. Now there's several provisions for setback. 12.7.6.1, the present regulation requires a street line setback of 10 feet unless the street is 100 feet or more in width, in which case the setback can be 0. And the applicant proposes that for properties fronting on Umpqua Road or Sanford Street, that the street setback can also be 0. This is not a specific recommendation of the TOD study. It was not addressed, but we did adopt a minimum setback in the TOD around Commerce Drive. We have a minimum of, or a minimum, I think, of 5 and a maximum of 18. So there's some, and when we'll see, we'll get to the photo study, and then we'll go back through it. Similarly, on side yard setbacks, our present regulation allows you to go to 0 on one side and have 10 feet on the other, and the applicant is proposing to allow 0 on both sides, limited to properties that front on Umpqua Road. In the last setback provision is our current regulations require additional setback for buildings that have a height greater than 30 feet. So for every 3 feet a building is taller than 30 feet, you need to step back 1 foot. And the applicant is proposing to eliminate that provision. Again, these 3 setback provisions are not specifically referenced at all in our TOD study. The last provision is parking. The present residential parking regulation for our TOD overlay is the lesser of 1 space per bedroom or 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit. And the applicant is proposing the lesser of 1 spaces or 1.25 spaces per dwelling unit. And there was a reference to that in the study that said the town should continue to collect information on residential parking utilization to determine whether it may be appropriate to adopt a TOD park overlay requirement of 1 space or 1.25. I will note, though, that we haven't adopted a TOD overlay in our downtown. There's only 1 TOD development, and it was specifically in the design residence district regulations for the project that's nearing completion at the former Knights of Columbus. But again, we'll talk about that. So I wanted to kind of remind you of what the proposals are. And I'm going to have now Emmeline walk us through the photo study so you can kind of get a sense. And these are buildings that you're all familiar with. And I will say that, you get a different feel walking the downtown than you do driving through the downtown. So we're going to step through, some of these buildings so you can get a comparison of what some of the existing heights and FAR statistics are, and then we can come back and talk about the individual regulations again. So I'll turn it over to Emmeline at this point.
And I just wanted to let everyone know that don't worry if you can't see the buildings as clearly right now, as we're just giving you the general context. Jim and I actually went out and we walked, the Center Design District, but we're gonna zoom in on some of these as we progress through the presentation. So we really kind of just walked up Beach Road and kind of started at that corner and then headed westward on the Post Road on the north side, and then ended up going down the south side, just to get a sense for, what were those, what were those, what was the scale and the height of the buildings as we're walking through from a pedestrian scale. Can you guys hear me okay? I know Kathy said that it was a little faint. Are we good?
Yeah.
I will say it's better now. You were a little faint, but you must have moved your location to your mic, so it's loud.
Okay.
Now.
All right, perfect.
And hi everyone. I'm here and I apologize for being late.
I'm out.
Okay, great. So if you look at where we're starting from, we do give, and I guess I probably should have done this in the reverse order as we're walking through, but if you're looking at the graphic, from left to right, we start with 1324 Post Road, and actually as you're walking along, you get this glimpse of what was actually one of the taller buildings, which was Tomlinson Middle School. And then, of course, because of the different grades along the Post Road, we also had the office buildings, which are up, separated from the street by a whole additional story. And then on the south side of the street, we end up with the varying buildings of the Brickwalk development. And again, we're going to focus on these individually, but we wanted to, just give you a sense of the massing and scale. The other thing I think that had come up in some of the public comment and discussion, and we just wanted to give you 2 snapshots of some of the zero setback lines. I do have to say, as planners, we tend to like structures closer to the sidewalk in our downtown areas. But we did give you kind of 2 views up, to kind of see, just the proximity of pedestrians to the street facade interface. And then the match point was really where we did the first walk to the second walk. It was the match point was really the Fairfield Public Library that you can see at the corner of Old Post Road and Post Road. And so we're going to kind of go building by building. Jim was able to research what the heights were on a good number of these where we could get them, and to calculate the FARs where we had either that information provided on a survey, or if we had, you know, that actually we could figure it out based on the plans. So, for example, the 2.5 structure, the 2.5 story structure at 1326 Post Road is approximately 35 feet high. Has a floor area ratio of 0.81 based on the lot size. And I think this alludes to also what Jim was talking about in terms of some of the developments that we see where, because you have to supply parking on site, even if the building ends up looking taller, if there's a good amount of surface parking that eats up a good part of the parcel, the FAR may not actually be as high as you assume that it would be. Again, in this first stretch of the center design district, on the easterly part of it, one of the tallest buildings was actually Tomlinson Middle School. And then, of course, we have the, you know, if you're walking along the sidewalk on the one side, even though you've got these 3 stories of office at 1210 Post Road, it really is kind of this 4-story presence because you've got a whole retaining wall that's 1 story tall. Jim and I thought this was really interesting when he looked at the elevations for 1189 Post Road, which is part of the Brickwalk development, which houses, most notably, if you're on the Post Road itself, the Joss Bank clothing store. That particular development is 46 feet to the 3rd floor roof deck. And this building has an FAR of 2. But if you look at the north elevation on the Post Road, one of the things that they did that's based upon our regulations is they did actually have to step back that area above the 30 foot. Jim, did you want to add anything to that while this
Yeah, I'm
elevation?
wondering if you can
You want me to
zoom
zoom
on
in?
that a little bit on
Yep.
the right-hand side. You know, this building, it surprised me. I did not recall because it's a flat roof and there's kind of a parapet around it. And maybe if you go a couple notches in, maybe even more if you can. The roof deck height here is 46 feet. And it doesn't feel that way when you look at it because of the way this building is designed with the multiple, you know, roof angles. But this is a really good example of how that additional setback above 30 feet plays out because the architect here actually shows it. You can kind of see the steps.
Can you
on
point
either
that out,
side.
Emmeline? As Jim's talking, can you point out what he's referring to, please?
Yep, right here. Sorry, continue, Jim.
So if you can see that they show a 30-foot building height, and then for each 3 feet it goes up, they show an additional inward foot of setback to demonstrate that the roof plane of this building sits within that stepped back setback.
Yeah.
So this is an example of how the additional setback above 30 feet can be applied. You know, it can be applied more dramatically, like you see it in taller buildings in bigger cities where you'll have above a certain, you know, height, you know, the building will set back 10, 15, 20 feet and then go, you know, continue upward. But in this case, we found this drawing that I thought really illustrates well that requirement. But I was a little surprised because it didn't, that, you know, as you look at this building, and you can go back now to the photo, scan back out a little bit. It doesn't, because of the varied roof lines and the way it sets back, it doesn't feel as tall as 46 feet, but it is in fact a 46-foot high building. So that's why we wanted to show that example. All right, you can,
Yeah.
unless there's questions about the way the setback is applied, we can continue.
Okay. All right, so as we continued along, on the south side of the street, most of this area is dominated by the many buildings that are part of the Brickwalk development. And, oh, sorry, that's me again. And so, and what's nice about that is that there's a lot of variation in terms of the spacing between what tends to be a singular building, but they have, various entries. So they really kind of break up the massing of the buildings. So here we have on the left side, 1243 Post Road, and that's got a height of 36 feet to the parapet. On the right side, we've got 1261 Post Road, which if you look at it, you could see I'm referring to photo G. And the height of that is 36 feet with an FAR of 182. And then, the white building in the middle is 1305 Post Road. The height is approximately 45 feet from street level. This is another one where if you look closely on the photograph, and I'll zoom in a little bit, but if you look closely at this photograph, there's actually quite a height differential in order to get to those many stairs up to the actual entry. So, this is a taller building than what it looks, given that it's got this whole platform where you have to walk up those stairs in order to actually enter the building itself. So that one was actually one of the higher FAR ones. That's an FAR of 2. And then we have, of course, our match point of 1080 Old Post Road, which is the Fairfield Library. And that has a 40-foot height to the ridge, 33 feet to the midpoint with an FAR of 1 due to, the open spaces that are around it.
Just before we leave this page, I just want to go back to the middle photo at 1305. And again, it's a 3-story building, but there is space in the basement. I think this building is kind of raised up on a pedestal because, there is an occupied basement there to get some window well lighting in there. But while 3 stories, it feels more like a 4-story building when you're standing there viewing it. But we can continue.
Okay. So then even though this building is under construction and hasn't been completed, we did actually want to provide an example of just an elevation for 78 Umpqua Place. Obviously, this is a much taller building right next to the train tracks. This one, the height to the roof deck is 63 feet. But then you've got that rather significant setback to the height of the elevator, which is at 72 feet 6 inches. So this is a much taller building. And obviously it maximizes its presence on its building footprint. So we didn't calculate the FAR for this one, right? So
I did not. When I just scanned, I should have, but that's.
But this is one where probably the FAR gets closer to, what would you speculate, Jim, about 3.5 to 4?
I would guess, yeah. I can certainly follow up with that FAR, but I would guess clearly larger than 3.
Yep. And then as we kept going, we did try to get more photos just for context in terms of what we're looking at. I think I see that Kathy had a question in the chat. She's asking, what do we allow now? Is it a 2 FAR and the applicant's asking for a 3?
That's correct. Yep. Present limit at 2, proposed 3.
Okay, and then as we progressed further west along the Center Design District, we have 1720 Post Road, which is there closest to where Carter Henry Drive intersects Post Road as you get closer to the underpass. We have a 1 to 2 story brick facade building, which is very close to the sidewalk edge. We have the community theater. We also have the building that was referenced previously at 1326 Post Road. course, the library, which is those two buildings are kind of our match point. And then we did want to show the Fairfield Center development at 1499, 140 Sherman Street, which is a 4-story office building, which is actually located on Sherman Street, but it's very visible due to the setback of the Rite Aid on the Post Road. And then we wanted to kind of give some context for the recently completed 1675 Post Road building with its adjacent buildings both on the right side and on the left side. So we'll zoom in on those as we progress down further west. So 1720 Post Road, the height to the midpoint is 38 and a half feet, whereas the top of the ridge at each of those circular elements on either side is 49 feet. And that building has an FAR of 1.5. When we look at the buildings that range between 1460 and 1474 Post Road, there's a good amount of parking behind those, and those buildings have an FAR of 0.8. And then for the community theater, there's very little extra space on that parcel. That building has a height of approximately 30 feet, and the FAR is 1.25 for that one. Oh, sorry. I think I mislabeled this one, and I apologize. I thought this was the newly completed building on Beaumont Street. This is actually on Bungalow. Bungalow Court, right, Jim? For the gray building on the left?
Yeah, that's Bungalow Ave. Bungalow Avenue
Ave.
is the westerly terminus of the Center Design District, but we capture that because that building looks rather big, but it's a 3-family house that fronts on Bungalow that was built in the 20s. I don't know, because it's so old, I didn't look up the FAR stats, but it's just a very visible building as you're strolling down the Post Road.
So we wanted to kind of also try to give you the 1675 Post Road from a couple of different angles, because I know that that's been, obviously that was an 830G project where our FAR limitations, our height limitations didn't apply. But one of the things that does work in its favor is, this is obviously a 4-story building from the street frontage. But if you look at the angles of the building, it obviously does have a 5th floor. But what is, now that it's been completed, that setback at the upper level really does help to really kind of limit the impact of that 5th floor. So when you look at this building, it is 56 feet high. It does have an FAR of 2.7. But you can see that, when you're along the street edge, that because that 5th floor, which I think, Jim, when we did the walkthrough, were there about 4 apartments up there on that level, or was it 6?
Actually, I think it's only 2. There's one
They were the
fairly
really
large
big
unit
ones,
up
right?
there. Yeah, so I think those are the 2. I think there's only 2 on that floor.
Okay. So, but as you can see, I mean, it really, it really limits the height to just that 4 stories, which, let me see, which is what we had for those. Then we have 140 Sherman Street, which has a height of 60 feet with an FAR of 1.4. Again, that's that's 4 stories.
It's actually, I'm sorry, it's 4 stories, but there is a 5th story underneath. It's hard to see
Parking.
in this
Yep.
photo with those cars in the foreground, but this building is essentially on stilts.
Yep.
With a small lobby. So it's actually one of the very few, aside from 1675 Post Road, really the only 5-story building presently downtown.
And then, on the south side of the street, we did we did take some photos for comparison of 1499 Post Road. That has a height of 30 feet and an FAR of 1.2.
I will say, I'm sorry to interrupt, Emmeline,
No,
but
that's
at
okay.
that
Go ahead.
height, 30 feet, that's measured to the roof deck. There is a fairly high parapet around that roof. So visually, it looks more closely like a 3-story building in its actual presence, but it's only 2 occupied floors.
And that's pretty much all we had. I don't know if, we kind of just did this as a resource to give you kind of visual context as you're discussing things. If what I can do is stop sharing now, but if as you guys are in the middle of your conversation, if you want to refer back to any of these photographs, we just hope that it helped provide some context as you're having your discussion.
Very good. And since Chairman Wagner is here, I'm happy to pass the baton to him.
So what we really wanted to do, like I said, aside from summarizing the proposals at hand, kind of give, as Emmeline said, give you kind of a contextual flavor of what we've got. And the question then becomes, we can talk about each of these individual proposals, but as I said before, keep in mind that they all have to work together, that an application has to meet all of those standards in order to go forward, not just any one of them. So the fact, so that there's pushes and pulls in all of these. And like I said before, usually the most common limiting factor on how much square footage can get built is the ability to produce the requisite parking for it. So that's why we see the vast majority. First of all, a lot of the buildings that were built downtown predated our regulations to begin with, but newer development happening, not at the 5-story maximum or not at the maximum FAR because they still have to supply the requisite parking. So, there were some recommendations in the TOD plan to perhaps give a little bit more opportunity to help in terms of potential reinvestment and some infill development. The question is, how do you feel about those individual components as they're now presented? And I will just leave it there and happy to answer any questions or help talk about any of the individual specific proposals.
Hey, Jim, Kathy has a question in the chat. She's asking, can you explain the impact of increasing FAR? I don't know if you want to take that, if you want me to
Sure.
start.
In an FAR of, again, assuming parking is met, an FAR of 2, and again, if you look through the examples that we provided, there aren't that too many buildings, if any, that have an FAR greater than 2 presently. But there are some buildings that, assuming they can get parking either off-site or else, or in combination perhaps with structured parking in particular, because if we count structured parking as we do in FAR, the ability to do more, like another story height above on the community theater building, for example, might be challenging to do at an FAR of 2. We had someone that was looking at a building on the corner of Miller Street. It was the Gap. I don't know what the name of the retail store is there now. Somebody was thinking about putting a couple more stories on that, but again, presuming they could park it, they were running up against FAR limitations. So it really is, to get a 3 or 4 story building, it's hard to do that with a FAR of 2. Now, is 3 the right number? That's the question to be discussed.
Increase the FAR, you increase height, density, you get more building.
Yes, it allows a bigger envelope of construction to increase the footage of the height and the overall total square footage you can put on a piece of property. But you still are going to have to be able to park that. But yes, it gives a little bit more flexibility in the parameters for what somebody can propose.
And just to clarify as well, I
Sure.
mean, it's relative to your lot size. So, when we look at that Sherman Street example, its FAR is not as high as we would assume it is, given that it's a 5-story building, because it does have a good amount of surface parking that's around it as well. So even though they are increasing the vertical massing of the structure, relative to the overall lot size, their FAR is still rather modest.
If you have an FAR of 3 and you want a 3.0 and you want a 4-story building, essentially you can use up to 75% of your lot. Is that right?
Correct. Your coverage, your footprint could be 75%, but more likely you'd have to have a lesser first floor footprint to create capacity for parking, and then stories above that, or structured parking, given the limited footprint with stories above that, in which case, the structured parking would contribute to the FAR requirement.
Which is why, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, is area that's dedicated to parking, is that included in the floor area?
If it's under the building, yes. For example, the Fairfield Center building, where Borders Fairfield University Bookstore is a 2-story footprint of retail, but there's a parking deck over the back. The area underneath that parking deck counts as square footage towards the maximum FAR.
Thank you.
And we should clarify that just the area above grade. So, for the 15 Umpqua Place project, we don't count FA. It's massing above grade, so we don't count subterranean parking levels.
But it's gross floor area, whatever is in the building, over lot size.
Correct.
And
Just a-
Kathy's asking another question in the chat. She's asking to confirm that FAR seems only to exceed the town limit of 2 in 830G cases, 78 Umpqua Place and Rowan.
Trouble hearing you.
Okay, so Kathy's asking the question as to our FAR projects that have gone over 2 seem to only be the 830G projects. So I don't know if anybody wants to answer that.
Yeah, I think that's yes. It's hard to find an example of a building that's existing that has an FAR over 2. In the 2 that we showed this evening are both 8-30G projects. That's correct.
Well, wasn't it previously limited to 2?
Right.
Correct. The existing limit is 2. That's correct.
Yeah, but Steve, the opportunity existed for pre-existing non-conforming developments, right, to have gone over that. Because a lot of the buildings in the district, a lot of the developments in the district, predated the zoning regulations. So I guess just kind of happens that they developed those, even though they weren't constrained by regulations, to below 2.
Yeah, most of the older buildings are more of a two-story profile, or maybe 2.5-story profile. So there wasn't, and again, with some parking, there wasn't, an FAR that exceeded 2. But again, just to kind of recap the proposals, the first proposal talks about discussing limitations on how much residential occupancy can be in a building. And again, the present regulation caps that at 2 floors of residential, but not more than 50% of the floor area of the building. And so what the TOD plan recommended was, are there areas of our downtown that make sense to increase that residential opportunity to more than 2 floors, or more than 50% of the area of the building? So we don't have, there were a couple examples, in the Brick Walk building, that Joseph A. Bank building at 1189 has a couple of apartments on the upper floor. We do have a handful of upper floor apartments, but we don't have, I don't know that we have a building downtown that's a 50-50 mix, but obviously with the marketplace as it is now, there's obviously more demand presently in the near term for multifamily than there is for office space. So I don't know how you feel about the, the concept of potentially increasing the opportunity for a greater percentage of multifamily in a building.
I think just to interject about the process, I think it does make sense for us to go through each of these TOD recommendations for changes to our regs in isolation and see what we think about them, and we can look at the all of the changes holistically. But I think in terms of this first point, I think that it would make sense to, as the TOD study suggests, eliminate the restriction on, that no more than 50% may be residential, and that no more than 2 floors may be residential. I don't know that restriction in itself advances any goals that are consistent with how we might amend our 2021 POCD, for example.
Well, I think your point is that without changes to the other regulations, the only thing that it's not gonna change the size or massing or setbacks or anything. It's just gonna change the mix of use within a permitted development today, right? And the way that we treated the 830G applications by refusing to allow commercial, a mix of any commercial with residential means that the developer would need to, if they wanted to, flap the regulations and go to 30G, that means they're building an entirely residential building. And that's not attractive to most of them when building on something downtown like that.
Yeah. Particularly since our existing regulations would preclude residential on the first floor, other than that one building.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's important, if I can, the area we're talking about is I'm looking at it, the Center Design District, it basically runs from Pine Creek all the way to Benson. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
No, it's actually a little bit less than that. It runs from Beach Road, the west side of Beach Road, to Bungalow.
Okay.
So if we
not quite South Pine Creek, but Bungalow.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
It goes to Bungalow. It goes a block west of Thorpe Street. If we just go back to that very top. So the intersection of Beach Road and Post Road is in where Emmeline's cursor is there. That's the Cumberland Farms gas station. So the west side of Beach Road is in the Center District. The east side of Beach Road is the Design Commercial District. And then as we proceed west, the boundary line is, as you see the intersection of Mill Plain Road and Thorpe Street there, 1 block to the west is Bungalow. That's the geography. So, the other question is that not question, but just issue is that, the TOD study, again, talked about contextual infill, and whether, I guess the other option to consider is whether the recommendations in that study should be limited to a smaller geography or a subset of parcels within the downtown versus the entirety of the Center Design District. The application before us now is with respect to the entirety of the Center Design District, but kind of another question to kind of keep in the back of your head as we think about this is whether or not it might be appropriate to have a more limited geography to the application of some of these proposals rather than the whole district. But I'll leave that to you just to float it out there.
Yeah, I see Tommy's hand up, and then Kathy.
Yeah, the possibility of doing an overlay is interesting to me to limit it more as opposed to going it completely the whole district. My other thought was, before we to go off of what Lenny had said, I do agree with one, like the initial edits and recommendations make sense, getting rid of that first part. My only thought was to do this orderly, I would think maybe we might be better focused on like the big ticket items, height, and maybe FAR, to kind of see where we are with, do we want a 4-story? Do we want a 3-story? And then kind of work our way from there. Because I think my guess is that's probably the big ticket items that need to be addressed first. I think everything else may fall into place after that. So I just want to put that out there. First, I agree with Lenny with the first parts of those edits, but also maybe going towards the height and the FAR, which may be next in their own right, but as a way to proceed forward.
Thanks, Kathy.
What's the
You're on
sort of
mute.
underpinning, can you hear me?
Yep.
Underpinning or reasoning behind the limitations on residential to no more than 50% of the total floor area or no more than 2 stories, which obviously is above first floor. What's the underpinning for those restrictions? And also, what's the downside if we eliminate those restrictions?
I didn't hear the second part to the question. What
What's
the
the-
underpinning
so-
to?
What was the
restriction?
underpinning? I got what was the underpinning behind setting up a standard of no more than 50% residential, commercial on the ground floor, residential being prohibited on the ground floor, and then if we eliminate those requirements, what is the downside?
Okay. Well, in my opinion, we're not proposing to eliminate the ground floor requirement for commercial. So in any case, we want, I think, in our downtown commercial district, for the downtown to be an active commercial space, either retail, and we actually require that it's even more limited than that it can't just be an office where there's not customer client traffic going on. It's the intent there is to have uses that create foot traffic, that you would have customers and clients coming and going and not just a closed door, corporate office in the downtown. So we're not proposing, nor is the applicant proposing, to eliminate the requirement of first floor commercial occupancy. The question is, I think when the residential mixed use provisions were adopted, folded into the late 80s, and we haven't seen a tremendous applicability of that, but the marketplace is changing. I mean, we're seeing a much more stronger market demand for rental housing product than we've ever experienced before. We've never seen applications for a rental housing project in 30 years. And now, obviously, we're seeing many of them. And I think that's just reflective of the changing housing demands. Certain segments of the marketplace don't want ownership units. They want something different. And, and that's kind of what the market study is showing. So yeah, it's a snapshot in time. But at present, there really isn't a strong demand for office space. And the question is, is the downside is that if we eliminate these restrictions, are we going to get nothing but residential or too much residential? I think there's pretty strong demand, but I guess you need to decide what's the best mix. It started at 50-50, to keep it essentially a commercial district with some complementary retail. The question is, given the changing economics and preferences, is that limitation too restrictive?
I think that Kathy, the original vision was that there would be this retail on the ground floor, and you're gonna have a couple of stories above that. And so the question then becomes, so what of that? And if you limit the overall use to 50% residential, it means that you're going to have some commercial space, office space. So you'll have, retail foot traffic on the ground floor, and then in the stories above the ground floor, you'll have a mix of offices and residential units throughout the downtown district. And so I think my personal opinion is that the risk, if you call it a risk, the result of eliminating that restriction on no more than 50% residential is that you're going to find development of retail commercial on the ground floor and then several stories of residential above that, right? I mean, And so, framing it as a quote risk means that is undesirable. Framing it as a result means that it's merely the factual playing out of the application of the regulation. You follow me? So it just depends on your perspective.
I'm just wondering, is there a downside on infrastructure? And also, if we were going to relax it, I assume we would require 10 or 15% affordable deed restricted so that we would get credit for that.
I would say that, there's no, the present regulation would require if any development yields 10 or more units, that there's a 10% affordability minimum. The commission in the Metro Center development redesign bumped that percentage up to 12%. So that's something for you to consider as well. So yes, the short answer, yes, there would still be an affordable component for over 10. The other thing I wanted to say is that the TOD study kind of bore out, and what we've seen from developments that have been taking place is that a fairly decent sized rental residential development is really a commercial development. It behaves similarly to a commercial development in terms of its value, in terms of what it generates in tax dollars. We have not seen or experienced an influx of school kids. Our numbers are still showing that these types of developments generate fewer kids than do other typical residential developments. So those are all things that I think the commission, at least in the Metro Center examples of those larger developments of 100 and 160 units, which are quite large, certainly for Fairfield standards, are behaving and are in all sense commercial, even though they're only limited to one story of occupied commercial space.
So,
Do you really have a restriction like this 50% residential, either in Greenfield Hill or a small, like a deli area with 2 buildings on one property? And didn't we get rid of it? We didn't get rid of it. I see. Okay.
We maintained the 50% overall limit of residential on a particular property. If you had multiple buildings, you allowed a building to be 100% residential, for example, which was approved, in the second building being 100% commercial. So it still maintains the 50-50 residential occupancy, but you eliminated the 2-story cap and ground floor occupancy under certain circumstances where there was a sufficient setback from the street, so you weren't going to have that street relating retail.
And I know it's a completely different property, neighborhood design district, neighborhood business district, probably. So it's definitely not downtown, but I just wanted the thought crossed my mind.
The other example of the largest example of a mixed use development is in Southport, where the Delamar Hotel is, and some freestanding condos where we've got multiple buildings of townhouse type construction that are solely residential, then a commercial component, and that total mix does not exceed 50-50. But I do agree with what Commissioner Noonan said earlier too, that looking at all of this holistically, I guess you need to settle, have some discussion too on the FAR and total height limitations, because that might drive some of the other the other standards as well. But so
and I would just throw parking in there too, because it's also very much related to those two in terms of development.
Yeah, like I said, they all tie together. It's not one. All of the elements need to be satisfied in order for a development to go. So it's a complete package.
Well, maybe to get past just the residential, I mean, I don't see any reason to retain that. I think the market will speak for itself, whether it's a result or a risk. The market will speak, and I think at this point there's a strong demand for people to be able to live downtown, not to have to cut a lawn and to walk Central. So that's the present climate as I see it.
Commissioner Brayman.
I agree. I think also views are changing about the aesthetics of mixed-use development in downtowns. One example that comes to mind from the neighboring town is Bedford Square in Westport, with the restaurants and retail on the ground floor, and then multiple stories of residential on the above.
So that's I raised that's where like the Williams Sonoma is, and the right, and all that. That's Bedford Square.
East Trattoria.
Yeah, and the Wafu is in the middle there, right?
The old YMCA site.
Yeah. So I think that they did a great job redeveloping that city block in that way, and I see that as apropos of the Exide battery factory site, more so than I do the downtown district, simply because there's a depth to that which I don't perceive as being available in the downtown district, right? I mean, everything we're talking about tonight with these regulations in this district are properties that front the post road, and they vary even among themselves in depth, right? And it doesn't really go back. There's not, I don't see the opportunity to make sort of, I'll call them interstices of, ups and downs and little, insets and little areas and what have you. So I'm not sure I would apply the same kind of metrics that you see at the Bedford Square to the downtown district, at least the parcels that are like fronting the post road and such.
Yeah, I would agree
Am I thinking about that?
You'd have to aggregate a sufficient number of parcels to get the same footprint that development has. And I think that's what happened there, that there were multiple parcels that kind of got combined. There are some parcels that are larger than others, but to fully get the full benefit to do all of these things, to max out in every respect, would certainly require a much larger parcel than the typical single parcel presently downtown.
Yeah. So I think another exercise that would be helpful is to understand the proposed regulations on various sort of parcels around the district, right? I think one of the difficulties that I had, and I think others did as well, is not really. We saw what the impact would be or could be at 15 Umpqua, right? I mean, we saw a rendering of what that would look like, and I think that to a lot of folks was a little over the top, dense, street to street, without any room in between buildings, and literally a zero setback next to, the others. And so, how would the regulations as proposed by the applicant here impact, a parcel, like right in the center of town, and in some of the places that you guys have scoped out on your walks. That to me is the only way I think we can really, assess and analyze the proposals. Now, when we did the TOD study and we had the consultants, they came in and they had the resources to, put up mock cities, right? Or like landscapes with the and
Yeah.
the buildings and the visuals and all of that kind of stuff. Me personally, I'm struggling with understanding conceptually the impact of the regulations in various places around the district. And, you know, being candid. Commissioner Corcoran.
So in this proposed or the proposal that was withdrawn, one of the things that concerned me is if there's no setback on Sanford Street, that whole street could become a narrow canyon.
Yeah.
I mean, very different than it is now. That's my point.
Yeah. Yeah, Meg, go ahead.
Yeah, and what I found that we should be cognizant of is the height of one structure next to the other. You know, whatever they were proposing might not be that bad in and of itself somewhere in the district, but next to, it was over 50 feet, and it was next to a 30-foot community theater and a small restaurant. You know, we have to be careful of that, in my opinion.
Yeah, the other, again, just to recap the overall proposals, we've talked a little bit about the limitations on the residential occupancy. We've talked a little bit about FAR going from 2 to 3. Height is proposed to actually reduce a story. The question is, what's the right height for the number of feet? And then we have the setback proposals. The only parking provision there the applicant is talking about is just with respect to residential occupancy. But so the setbacks, I'm hearing some concern about a broader approach to zero street line setback if that's applied more broadly. But you know, there are. But at the same time, I think if you're not comfortable with zero, we should probably consider a maximum setback, because by the same token, I don't think you'd want to encourage a building that has parking in front of the building. I think that's pretty much, if I'm not mistaken, a fairly universally accepted provision of what sets our downtown apart from, for example, Black Rock Turnpike, is that the buildings are much closer to the street, creates a more
Getting some feedback. If you're not talking, can you please mute?
It creates a much better pedestrian environment for a building to be closer to the road and to discourage parking from being in front. So if zero isn't the right number, I think we should consider at least a maximum setback and not allow in the center design district, you know, parking between the building and the street.
I agree with that.
And if I could as well, I mean, some of the places where I've worked where we have instituted maximum setback requirements, those maximum setback requirements have to have public amenities. So, you know, whether it's targeted for outdoor dining or it's targeted for additional landscaping or public benches, almost like I think what the design standards within the Commerce Drive district suggest within those areas, so that it's not just pavement. It's, you know, it's something that does add vitality to the streetscape, which is what we'd hope to have. And, you know, when you have that zero setback, requiring, you know, building articulation contributes to some of that. So that might be part of the discussion if you're concerned about, you know, just monolithic buildings on either side of the sidewalk.
Yeah, no, and also a wide enough sidewalk that can, you know, enable the the sip and stroll and the outdoor dining and the foot traffic and the park bench and the garbage can and right. I mean, you're trying to create community space um,
And
that
if I
encourages
could,
all that.
one of the ways that you can do that is that you can say, in areas where there's only a 6-foot sidewalk, you can create the difference in the setback that's required for the building if that's the goal. So I think identifying what the goal is in terms of what you want the feel of the streetscape to be helps you then define what you're looking for in terms of proposing those regulations.
Yeah, so if you even, you look at 15 Umpqua, the building that, at issue with the regulations as proposed, that's a really narrow sidewalk area, right? So how do the regulations that we're thinking of now apply to a parcel like that?
Well, I mean, if you want a 10-foot wide sidewalk plus whatever, then you would say if there's only a 5-foot wide sidewalk now, then your requirement's going to be an additional 5-foot setback in order to accommodate. But I think you have to identify what that goal is within your regulation, so that it's understood why you're asking for that setback.
Yeah, I see Commissioner Levy and then Brayman.
Yeah, and I think, my sense when we were looking at the 15 Umpqua was the concern was largely just how massive that seemed, both front and back. I think on the side yards, even with 0, that's largely what we have in the downtown area with all the non-conforming. In terms of the setback on the street level, I mean, to maintain the uniformity of a lot of the buildings down there, you would want to keep it at 0. And I think you'd want a maximum, which would be perhaps 10 or 10 feet or more, but they're about 10 feet, but limited to areas where it would be for public use. I think one of the ways we might want to think about it is maintaining the setback for the let's say we're talking 4 floors, to require that the either 3rd or 4th floor, one or both of them have setbacks, which then reduces the sort of ponderousness of the the presence of the building, similar to the way the 5th floor on Ruane Street minimizes the impact of that building on the corner. So it might be that we are less concerned about having it front right on the street line on the ground floor, but maintaining requirements up above to minimize the overall impact.
So,
Any?
what if we took a small section of the Post Road area, as was, suggested potentially for an overlay zone, and had a form-based approach to it, right? This is sort of something we haven't done before in Fairfield, but other towns have taken areas of the town and they've had an overlay zone where they have an idea of how they want the streetscape to look or how they want buildings to look. And then they work backwards from there. So what we're having trouble with is we want to know what the new building at 15 Umpqua would look like. And then, we would adapt our current regulations to prohibit certain things or to encourage certain things. But if we had a form-based model, just for this small section of town, which could, in theory, could be from Umpqua or opposed to, say, Reef, or wherever you like. And then we figured out what we wanted it to look like. And then we had a menu of options that the form-based codes utilize for what the building can look like in different parameters that have to be satisfied. Then we would be sort of, rather than prohibiting only certain things, we would actually be able to encourage or require certain things in terms of what we as the town planning commission would like to see in the future for certain buildings in a certain part of town.
I'll leave that for Jim and Emmeline to. What's the reaction to that?
Well, that's certainly a possibility that certainly goes beyond what the present application is considering. But yes, it goes back to some of the themes that we've been hearing is what, what do you want it to look like? Setting a minimum, pedestrian width, for example, and a maximum height. I still think we need to have some kind of parameters of how big a box you can build, and then what you'd like to see the box look like. Are kind of they're related, but they're two different things. I said, you need to cap the maximum size on the box is one thing, and then how you'd like it to look is another. So I think it's a combination of things.
So I don't think that we should be hampered by, consider ourselves bound by, or restricted to the proposal that the applicants put in front of us. If we'd started looking at ways to revise the regulations to incent development of the downtown area and other areas in certain ways, through the study. We considered those. We suggested that, some of those might be, could have some legs, and frankly, kind of put those over to, this is the way I'm thinking about it, put those over to the, to the plan of conservation and development. We were going to incorporate findings from our work in the vision for the master plan, and then rely on developers to use that as a basis to seek amendments to our regulations for future development, right? One of the key components to an application to amend the regulations is that it's supported by specific provisions in the master plan, right? That's the way the whole system is supposed to work. Now, given COVID and other, circumstances, we were trying to dovetail our work product on the master plan with the strategic planning commission and the strategic report for the town. That kind of stalled. COVID hampered our abilities to continue with our roundtables and charrettes that we were doing in the process of, revising our master plan. So that's kind of been delayed, right? And so we never quite got there. And now we have a developer who's come in with these regulations and sort of inspired us to look at this stuff again. And so I don't think we ought to take this up if we're going to amend our regulations in this way. I don't think we should consider ourselves bound by or limited by the developer's proposed amendments here. I mean, we should look at this the way that we think it ought to go, and then let this developer come back to us with a proposal that is consistent with our vision and what we believe is the better way to go. I look that's the way I'm thinking about it. Thoughts, Kathy?
So the form-based plan is something being advocated by some of the zoning law change advocates in Hartford. And that, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that means once you pick the plan, there's no need for zoning approval. It doesn't follow zoning regulations. It just gets automatically rubber stamped. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, it can be, and a lot of form-based codes, it's prescriptive that you set out the look that you want and the parameters that you want, and in many cases, it does become a so-called as of right development where it's less of a discretionary process. That once you've done the work and set those standards and put those design elements in place, and you have an application, your judgment then is whether or not the applicant complies with those standards and becomes less, more certainty from the applicant's point of view. But it doesn't have to be.
No.
But I don't disagree at all with anything that the chairman just said, and perhaps, before you came on, I said it was before I even started my comments, that it's refreshing to be in a position where this is a completely discretionary application where you have very broad legislative discretion, rather than an application where you've got, two hands tied behind your back. So
Yeah.
you have absolutely the full discretion to decide whether the timing is right for any or all of these, or whether or not more groundwork needs to be done before you're ready to implement some of these recommendations that are in this plan.
Yeah. And the interesting thing to me is the kind of amendments that are proposed by the applicant would likely be more appropriate in other places in the district rather than at 15 Umpqua, right? I mean, just in terms of the size and scale. All right, so, where to begin? I mean, so I feel like we've now been, I know I was a few minutes late, but the meeting's been going on about an hour and a half now, and don't feel like we've discussed, but we've not considered anything really specific. I don't know where to go. Go ahead, Emily.
Can I just make a recommendation that maybe we can send around the link to the TOD study, just the final draft, because I feel as though some of the questions that I hear many of the commissioners asking and discussing, I think if we just refresh ourselves with the content of the TOD study, I think that would be really helpful, because they do talk about design issues, the intention, and I think, I mean, at Jim and I as
And also provide
planners,
examples, right?
exactly, exactly. And I think that, with any of this, it's not about whether or not we change our process and things are as of right and you eliminate public hearings. It's about giving property owners consistency, clarity, in a way in which is consistent with what we want to see. So there's no second guessing for both parties, right? So this is something where we fully identify, here's what we want our downtown to look like, and we give them the pathway to develop a project that's going to make the commission and the constituency happy. I mean, I think that's the end goal, right?
Yeah, and as well as making the residents happy, right? Our fellow citizens of the town of Fairfield, and inspire commerce and all of those good things. And I also agree. I echo that. I don't know that I don't believe that simply having quote unquote form-based regulations eliminates oversight. And even to necessarily public hearings. So I think that's a great idea. I don't know what exactly we were, honestly, what I was hoping to accomplish this evening. I don't know how far we were supposed to get. This application is going to come up again on our next agenda, right? So process-wise, procedure, how much time do we have left on this? If we don't act on it, is this one that gets deemed granted or deemed denied?
Well, to answer the first question, without extension, you've got to the 17th of June to act.
Okay.
I would not want to be in a position where we don't act within that time frame.
Yeah.
And as I said at the outset, you've got the broadest discretion that you have as a commission when you are deliberating on regulation amendments.
Yeah.
So I think that what we were trying to accomplish tonight is kind of refresh the commission's recollection on what the package includes and provide you some context of what our current downtown looks like and what some of those existing design elements look like on the ground to see if there is a fit with some of these or not. And what I'm hearing is I think there's at least maybe not unanimous, but sensitivity to the changing dynamics of the marketplace in terms
Yes.
of multifamily housing, but struggling more so with how that would be packaged in terms of its upper limits of height, how many stories, how far back from the street it should be set back, in the finer grain details. So I'm hearing some support for the concept of perhaps relaxing some of the residential pieces, but fine tuning some of the others. But also, I hear you loud and clear, Mr. Chairman, that perhaps we're not there yet with some of the background work that we're undertaking to get us to the implementation stage.
Yep, I think that's a very fair statement.
I would not suggest being at the point where a decision isn't made within the time frame of the statute. I haven't discussed with the applicant a potential extension, but we still have to the 17th of June in the absence of an extension. So there's time.
Yep.
So again, it's harder in the context of a regular meeting to have a broader discussion like we're trying to undertake tonight. I know it's difficult.
It's more difficult. It's more difficult to have a meeting like this over Zoom video.
Without a doubt. And we are talking in some elements, in the abstract. So we're trying to become less abstract by showing some visual stuff. So I understand. We can send out some additional links, to help refresh where we've been. But at the end of the day, if it's the commission's position that the timing isn't right yet, then so be it. That is for you to determine. And that would,
I'm not suggesting necessarily that timing isn't right for us to implement some changes to the regulations for the district. We're talking about overlays. We're talking about different types of regulation amendments that would have a different impact on lots in different circumstances in different areas. Talking about a 10-foot wide sidewalk or a 5-foot, or having the mix of commercial, office, residential. It just, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of variables there. That's all. Commissioner Brayman and Francis.
When you
You're
send
on mute,
out,
Lenny, hold on, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, just a note on process. I personally don't think I'm in a position tonight to be able to decide, I want to amend the regulation. I want to amend this regulation and not the other, right? I don't know that any of us are. And we're not, discussing the application itself tonight with respect to the text change from 15 Umpqua, the applicant. But I think we could be I personally could be in a position to make a decision on that application when it next comes on our zoning agenda. I think that it's valuable for us to keep going as long as people are comfortable going tonight, talking about the different TOD recommendations that we amend our regs and see how far we get. We're certainly going to need at least, another planning meeting even to continue discussing it, and perhaps multiple planning meetings.
Agreed. No, I think that's right. Commissioner Francis.
when Emmeline sends out the TOD material, would she also include the slides tonight? And she wanted to make a couple of corrections about one street name and a couple of floor area ratios that were missing.
Yep, I think that's also a great idea, because there were some things on those slides that I would like to have kind of zoomed in on myself and, sort of looked around at a couple of different things.
We can absolutely distribute the file that you saw tonight. For those of you that were on the commission in the fall of 2019, you should have a hard copy of that TOD plan. For those of you that don't, I can provide that. But at a minimum, we can certainly send the link. It is posted on our website to read and review. But everything that we looked at tonight, including the remarks that I made, we can certainly provide to you, so you can refer to that to see, the summary of the proposals. But
Yeah.
again, I'm not suggesting that. I agree with Commissioner Brayman, to the extent you want to continue the dialogue on any specific proposals, we're still prepared to do so.
Yeah. So what's next?
Okay, so we talked about I'll go back here, sorry. So we talked about the percentage of residential. So FAR and height kind of play in off each other. Like I said, the existing requirement is a maximum FAR of 2. The TOD study recommends an FAR of 3. And then I think building height is a question of, kind of a foundational question of what you're comfortable with. The plan is proposing reducing from 5 to 4. As I said, we have one example of a 5-story building and 2 others that are 8-30G. The proposal will reduce that to 4. And whether that's the right fit is something also to consider along with the FAR. And then the other package, the rest of this is the setback package, essentially, of 0 on the street on Umpqua and Sanford. I'm sorry, 0 on side yards for Umpqua and Sanford, 0 on the street. And because the present regulation, you can only go to 0 on one side. We do have several blocks within the downtown where buildings are at 0 on both sides. That's not the case in the entirety of the downtown. We have examples where there's 0 on one side and 10 on the other. So it's the existing conditions are a bit of a mix with respect to setbacks from a side yard perspective. But for the post road in general, most of the setbacks are up close to the street at 0 or not much greater than that. So that's the broader mix of the remaining sections that are on the table.
Yeah.
2 overarching sort of concerns. One is that TOD is in a it's apples and oranges completely with downtown. I don't see any way you could put a trademark downtown anywhere. Maybe on Exide, but that would be pretty hideous to put on that property. But so I just don't see how the TOD study can translate, although it would be interesting to see is sort of a chart, like every change he's suggesting. We could see a chart showing what the TOD said, and then if you explode it out in your mind the way it was either Attorney Burke or Attorney Green that said when 15 Umpqua came up, you could have one big box next to another big box. If the worst case scenario was exploded out, what would it look like if these things were approved as they are? That's my concern, that it's not in the same area, different infrastructure, different downtown character. And what would happen if everything went the same way according to the regs that are being proposed?
Yeah. So and then I'll come back to Emmeline. So that's kind of what I was asking earlier about examples of what the proposed amendments would look like if implemented, and not just what the applicant was proposing, but what our work on the studies and such produced, right? Emmeline?
Oh, I just want to remind the commission that in the TOD study, the larger the larger focus was, of course, Metro Center, but there was a whole section that talked about downtown and how it was different. So if,
Mhm.
again, hopefully, Commissioner Braun, when you look at that study, it'll be clear that there was a distinct difference in terms of what was appropriate for Metro Center and what was appropriate for downtown based on existing fabric. So, I hope that, when you look at when you look at that study, it'll make more sense in terms of we're not trying to plop 10 trademarks down in downtown. It was a very different thing. But I think what was helpful about the study is that it really talked about the amenities that we want to see in terms of the shape of the buildings, the interaction with the sidewalk and the
Mhm.
public spaces. So those were the aspects that I think, as we're looking at how we regulate private property, getting to some of those goals through some well-written regulation, that's part of the process in getting there, but also giving developers an understanding as to what are you asking them for. We're again, we're trying to hopefully provide regulations that give developers the tools to propose what we want to see.
Right. That makes sense. Lenny?
Sounds from the it sounds like from the presentation that there's this interaction between the parking requirement, the height requirement, and the FAR. That, like, as was said, you'd need, a model city or a computer model to be able to see exactly in real time how slight changes in the FAR or the height or the parking would interact with each other to create different looking structures and a different looking streetscape. I mean, that's a tall order. If we really need to see exactly what our town will look like if we make certain changes to our regulations, which I think is incumbent on us, that would require some, sophisticated work. The other way to do it would be to take, as I said, a small area and figure out what we want it to look like, and then work backwards from there.
Yeah, so that and in the document that we're referencing, there are various proposed amendments to the regulations along with examples of what those new regulations would look like if they were built. So to your point, what do you want it to look like? Design regulations, that would, if built, would look like what you want it to look like. Your other point though is that is to account for, unintended consequences, right? Because unless you model all of the variables, right, you're not going to fully appreciate how things might look given slight tweaks here and slight tweaks there, even within the context of the regulations, right? Because, it's what I'm trying to say is that example that we're showing of a particular amendment is only sort of one example of how the regulations might be implemented, right? Just because we have a setback at X and a FAR of Y and a this and that doesn't mean that every developer is going to choose to max out on all of those different variables, right? They can choose to make some less, some here, more, whatever. So I don't think we need to get to that sophisticated 3D computer modeling where we see exactly how, things might shift around and everything. But to the point, to your point though, we should try to embody in an amendment to the regulations what we would like to see built, how we would like to see the landscape developed. I mean, does that make sense?
It does. The other thing, I'm sorry, Stacy, the Commissioner
Yes,
Levy wants to
Steve, yeah.
speak, but the other thing we can do in addition to the final document that we ended up with, you know, for those of you that participated will recall that we had several workshop sessions for that TOD study that had some visual examples that were used as part of the discussions that we had during that process that aren't in the final document that we can go back and provide to you to kind of help with some of that. Hey, what is you know, what does some of these things look like? Because and again, and we perhaps in retrospect should have queued some of those up tonight. But you know, we did have some discussion on, hey, what is an FAR of X look like? We did that, tried to do that with our example downtown, but we can expand upon that discussion with some of those examples that our architectural consultant provided for that discussion process.
But I think that'd be helpful because the bottom line is we saw today 1.75, 2.5, whatever, but the applicant is asking for 3. And we're talking about what does a 4 look like, right? Steve?
Thank you. I think, you know, perhaps with, you know, with some key questions, we can get closer to where we want to go. I mean, so often zoning seems to be, or zoning regulations seem to be what you can't do. If we approach it to how do we draw up our regulations so that a developer can do what we want him to do, it might be a lot easier from that perspective. I mean, right now we allow 5 stories and 50 feet, but nobody could build that if they tried in any of these downtown. If we ask the question, do we want to allow 4 stories downtown? And if we say yes, and if we want 15 feet on the first floor, then we have a height of 45 feet. If you want a gabled roof above it, you might have a higher limit, which would allow for, you know, some sort of more interesting roof treatment. But I mean, the first question would be, do we want to allow 4 stories downtown? If that comes yes, then the rest sort of falls into place. Are we concerned about, you know, how massive the building will be? Yes. How do we deal with that? Well, maybe we need setbacks up above. I mean, sort of, you know, brainstorm, you know, what we want, or even things like mixed use. If there's a market demand to have residential or more residential, then the question, then eliminating a 50% sort of falls into place. That's how I might approach it.
Mm-hmm. No, good comments. And for me, it's less about the number of stories than it is about the overall height.
Yeah, so I'm going to suggest that, as I just said before, that maybe we need to go backwards a little bit before we go forward, because it has been.
Well, it's been a while, and not everybody was there.
Correct. It's been a while since we had those discussions. We have the materials from those presentations that we can share with you, and we'll get those out to you, and then we'll be better positioned to have a more perhaps more fruitful discussion. But you know, this was helpful. It's helpful to kind of talk it through. But I think it would be beneficial to go backwards a little bit and refresh our collective recollections on what the visual materials we had that gave rise to these discussions, that gave rise to these particular recommendations.
Yeah, and also gave rise to the applicant's proposal, because you know, let's not lose sight of the fact that for each one of their proposed amendments, they were, you know, citing back to our own study where we, you know, developed this and adopted a position saying, yeah, we like it, right? Yep. Only to get an application which proposed the amendments along with the building that was not what we all anticipated.
Correct. So I think we can work on our end to get a package of material to you for you to look at, and then we can continue the dialogue.
Okay. Is that by a show of hands, is that satisfactory for everyone? Or yeah? All right. Okay. Good. Okay. So should we look at calendars then for another planning meeting? While we're all sitting here and on the line? Because it's not going to happen during a regular session. And we do have this thing coming up. What you said it was June, right? June something? June 17th?
Yeah, in the absence of an extension, I've got to get my agenda again. I've buried it under my notes.
Yeah.
It's on the agenda if I can find it. June
That's the
17th.
17th. And Jim, for June, we would have June 8th and June 22nd as our two meeting dates, our regularly scheduled meeting dates. I don't know if those are booked.
Yeah, there may be an opportunity, Mr. Chairman, given our present hearing schedule. And again, we may be able to dispense with a public hearing portion of our agenda at our next meeting on the 25th. We have time based on what we've got in the hopper to schedule to push those to June if you want to use the next regularly scheduled meeting, which is the 25th, 2 weeks from yesterday, to have a planning discussion. We may need to have a short administrative session in advance of that, but we could consider that.
Sure.
Dispensing with the public hearing on that evening and setting aside the greater portion to continue this dialogue.
Yeah. I mean, so what old business? We're going to have the Pizza Co. And
in the item in the regulations that we're talking about tonight.
yeah, which we'll table again in favor of another planning meeting and further consideration.
Right. We are not up against we've got some things in the hopper that wouldn't suffer from being pushed to the first hearing in June to get started with. So we have the ability. I mean, we certainly can put another meeting date on the calendar should you wish to do so, but I think the opportunity may present itself for us to forego a public hearing on the next meeting on the 25th.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm fine with that. There's no need to schedule another night if we don't have to. Steve?
Yeah, I was just wondering, do we have to notice our planning sessions and how long in advance? Public notice?
We do. If we're doing an off-calendar meeting like we are this evening, they do need to be. That's why if you look at the agenda, it's termed a special meeting because it's not a regular meeting. The minimum notice is 24 hours in advance with the town clerk, but we like to do so obviously as early as we can. But like I said, the opportunity I think is there to use our next regularly scheduled meeting to continue this dialogue. And if we have to schedule an additional meeting outside of our regular schedule after that, we certainly can consider that.
Yep. No, that sounds good. So you guys can take, a couple of days to get some materials together, and we'll use that time to continue the discussion and make progress.
Very good.
Okay.
We appreciate your time and attendance on a double header, so to speak. So
yeah.
Well, you'll be hearing from us in the coming days.
All right. Sounds good. Good night, everyone.